pleased to be joined today by John Singleton, the founder of the Progrm, who's calling in from Mallorca, is it, John? An island just outside of Barcelona?
Exactly. I'm calling in from Mallorca and excited to be able to chat today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, John. We've just chatted about I'm a little jealous of your location today because it is 8 degrees and about a foot of snow on the ground where I'm located here in Pennsylvania. So hopefully we could switch places soon enough. But we are here today, John, to talk a little bit more about HYROX. I know we were fortunate enough to have you on The Next Rep, which is our podcast here at Wodify, but wanted to dedicate some time outside of that just to kind of zeroing in a little more on just some views and takes you have on HYROX and where it's headed. Before we dive in, if you don't mind, just kind of give us a quick snapshot of who you are, just your background, how you got involved with HYROX initially, and kind of the role you play in programming and supporting gyms in that area.
Yeah, so I think training just had a huge impact on my life from my early teens. When I was like 13, 14, I'd always done classic sport, school sports. I'm from the UK. I play football, soccer, rugby, things like that. When I was 13 or 14, I got involved with Chinese martial arts, and that really just set my love for training. Probably since that moment, it's just been a staple of my life. And so I've always done some form of training, more of those kind of Chinese martial arts, a bit more alternative, I suppose, but also alongside that, I also boxed. And in and around 2006, when I was at university, is when I first started training CrossFit. And obviously, 2006, the space was pretty different to how it is now. I remember my friend at university. He kind of came up to me, we were both young at that time, and he was like, you're not very fit. And I was like, well, I am fit. And so we ended up going to this Globo gym. And I mean, I can't imagine, looking back now, just how crazy we must have seen, these guys and basically 20 years old just running. I think we did filthy 150 as like the workout. And we were running around to all these different stations, just like doing jumping pull-ups and trying to use whatever machines we could have. And so that's when I first started CrossFit, and I kind of fell in love with it. At that time, the training space, no one really trained hard. It wasn't a thing. Like, people did very soft classes, like Pilates was a big thing. And I think it's hard for people to realize these days, squatting below parallel, for example, was seen as a bad thing to do.
Yes. Bad for your knees.
Yeah, bad for your knees, and also like there's crazy things like just even pulling behind your neck was something that's bad for the shoulders. It was almost full range of motion was almost seen as a bad thing, which is kind of crazy to think about now.
It is.
And I've been lucky enough to, I wanted to be an athlete originally, but I only got to like kind of the semi-final or regional levels back then. And my real passion kicked in with coaching, and I've been lucky enough to coach some of the best athletes in the world, most notably like Sarah Signan's daughter back when she podiumed at the games. And since then, we've managed to build a relatively successful company with the Progrm, and that's kind of transitioned more recently as well to incorporating HYROX. So I think most people have heard about HYROX now, and it's interesting to see how quickly that growth has become. We were actually the first official training program of HYROX. So this is about 2 years ago now. We were the first kind of incorporate. So HYROX offers it kind of like an affiliate. If you're as CrossFit affiliates are similar with, but you can become an affiliate with HYROX for your online training program. And so we were the first to do that, come through, and it's been fascinating to watch how quickly it's grown relative to the CrossFit space. And I think CrossFit in essence just had to pave so much of the way for this style of fitness, for this type of training. And HYROX has just really capitalized on that and also managed to make some very clever decisions to really grow it to these levels we've not seen before. And this year because they work off a competitive year from June to June, they're expecting around 1.2 million athletes to be participating in an actual live HYROX event, which is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's an incredible number. And it seems like, I'm interested in your take on this, John, but it seems like there's also sort of been a rise of interest in endurance sports. So in some ways, HYROX was able to retain what was really popular and enjoyable about CrossFit, add in that element of endurance training. I mean, I think Strava just sold for multiple billions of dollars, right? So it seems like there's this boom of endurance interest, and they're kind of at that perfect intersection of what people loved about CrossFit and also the taking advantage of that rise of endurance training.
I think each of these, you need a bit of luck in releasing these things. And I think HYROX had that luck in the timing, in the sense, running's obviously been around as the original sport at the dawn of time.
Been around a long time.
Yeah, and through that time, it's seen like highs and lows and highs and lows, probably more so than any other sport. And it just so happened that the sport that they'd invented and captured has 8 kilometers of running, and so you've got this perfect combination where CrossFit led the way of this functional fitness movement, everyone getting used to using machines or squatting below parallel, using odd objects, and you have this reinvigoration of running and endurance. They've combined those together, and it's just like wildfire has gone through the fitness space. And actually, I think with you guys, we spoke about this. It's kind of a bit like a Venn diagram where you have these, you have the CrossFit space, you have the running space, and you also have, a bit more of a traditional training space. And the HYROX has managed to capture from all of these worlds to go and do an event, which is, I think, the impressive thing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's dive into a big question first here. Should every gym be thinking about adding HYROX in 2026? Like, is this something that, because of its approachability, it's just such a larger swath of gyms that would have the opportunity to add this style of programming? Is this something everybody should at least be considering in 2026 if you're a boutique or strength-focused gym?
So, do I think every gym should incorporate it? No. Do I think every gym should at least ask the question? Yes, because I think that's like a healthy thing to do. And I think, when you boil these things down, you ultimately have to look at your values, what you want to be able to offer. And, if you're taking it to some extremes, I remember back in the day, I've been lucky enough to go to train with Louis Simmons' conjugate. I don't think, for example, those guys adding in a HYROX class to their gym would be
a great example. Yes.
Be super successful. It's taking it to the extremes. But, there are some gyms that consider themselves purist CrossFit, and so I think adding the HYROX into that would not necessarily work. Whereas for other gyms who, they're looking to expand, looking to offer different types of classes, there's been lots of times, I think the original trend, like kind of the fashion within CrossFit at the start, was weightlifting. Weightlifting was so popular. People would have specific weightlifting classes that they would do, etc. And it's just so happened that the HYROX side of things kind of ticks the conditioning box. And so it's easy to go, okay, well, you've got this, as you said, the fashion of endurance is a lot more popular, albeit more in the running space. And then you combine that with a sport that, especially for CrossFit, is very conditioning based. And so I think it's an easy thing to label of like, go, okay, well, let's add in a conditioning class. Well, actually, you can then add on to that trend of going, well, let's call it a HYROX class, because then actually we may be able to capture more of the population that's doing it.
What are some signs when they're having those conversations, John, to consider adding something like HYROX to their offerings? What are some clear signs that HYROX would be a natural fit? And on the flip side, what are some signs, I guess we kind of already answered this maybe with the West Side Barbell comparison, but are there some obvious signs where you're like, I don't know if this is going to be a natural fit for this particular facility?
So I think for, ultimately there's, because of the big difference in the sport, like if we look at this, the training methodology of CrossFit, where you have this constantly varied, this unknown and unknowable component to it, whereas within the HYROX space, it's something that's completely the opposite, where you're going into this known and knowable space. You can train in a different way, periodize in a different way, and obviously it's no surprise to anyone that a big focus of that needs to be running, because of it's a large component of the sport and the race. And so I think it comes back down to that if your whole gym and whole methodology is based on one thing, then actually maybe incorporating and trying to push into another space is not. I think one of the reasons why it's very easy for CrossFit gyms to incorporate HYROX, but the reason it's so easy for CrossFit gyms to integrate is because the coaches are so good at coaching all the movements. You go to most runners and you go, well, even as something which seems to CrossFit coaches as simple as the row, actually that when you go to a Globo gym and watch people row, you realize that the technique for something that we look at as simple is not that simple. And then you have the more complex things of wall balls and being able to have that movement pattern, or even being able to lunge correctly. CrossFit is just very good at coaching these movements, and also the equipment and the space that you have in the gym is space there. So it's like a really easy add-on for most of the CrossFit gyms to put in, and that's why I think it can be an interesting one to test. And there is probably a component to, if the gym is struggling, membership's going down, you want to be able to reach out to new demographics. It's a very sensible thing to be able to do. Maybe you can, with thinking about that Venn diagram, that you have the runners on one side, it's a great way to be able to tap into a new market by going, okay, well, let's maybe lead them in with something that plays to their strength. And then as they go through that, they start to go, well, maybe I do want to get a bit stronger. Maybe I do want to start working different ranges of motion and not just focus on this one aspect of training. So I think that the ease of implementation means it's something that is a good thing to consider. And then because you can approach new markets with something that is easier for them to relate to, I think that's another good reason for gyms to consider it.
I love that. When you're having conversations about potentially adding in HYROX offerings to a gym sort of menu of services, shall we say, is there a common sort of hold-up coaches or owners are having? Is it that they're very comfortable coaching CrossFit specific movements and they feel comfortable in the realm of strength and conditioning or metabolic conditioning, but maybe they feel like they don't have the background in the running training? Or what's the big holdup that you've encountered when people are considering adding this, but they're just not quite there yet?
An interesting thing we found at the start was we're so used to seeing this constantly varied approach that actually the training style looks very different. And so a lot of people had difficulties, and this is where the programming came in from, is like being able to progress running, for example. Because if an athlete just goes out and runs 8K and you go, okay, well, I've got to run 8K, so I just keep running. If we're not building in a good progression for that, then it obviously leads to injuries occurring, etc., etc. So I think actually the periodization of the running and being able to introduce running in a good way and a safe way is something that's really important. And then this kind of variance of, in CrossFit you go, okay, I want a program. And you go, well, I have all of these movements, hundreds of movements that I can choose from. Even a snatch, you can go for a kettlebell snatch, a dumbbell snatch, a squat snatch, a power snatch, etc., etc. So each of these movements then has multiple options through it. And then all of a sudden you narrow this down to a sport that, to a runner seems like a lot of variance, but to us CrossFitters is very minute. Kind of learning to develop the progressions and not feel like you're just repeating the same thing is actually quite we've noticed has been challenging for people to implement.
And you had kind of mentioned, John, so like going from a position where there's constant variance to a sport that's a little bit more entrenched, and it's almost, and forgive my ignorance, but I always kind of compare HYROX almost to like the NFL Combine a little bit. Like, here's what you're going to be assessed with. Here's what we're going to be training for, and we're trying to constantly refine and improve our performance in this sort of combine environment. What's the challenge on your side for just keeping that programming fresh? Like, do you find it a little bit more of a challenge than, CrossFit, which kind of has that constantly varied movement built into it? Or is it a little bit more diving into like the nuts and bolts of linear progression and, figuring out ways to vary movement, but that still have carryover to the actual sort of eventual event that we know the events of and that we're going to be assessed with?
There's a few different ways to go this. It's interesting being a personal journey for myself because, so in the boxing training, like strength and conditioning for the style of boxing that I was doing, it wasn't very advanced. You just run. You run and skip.
Road work.
Yeah, there's no, there was no barbell or anything like that. Like the pretty old school gyms that I used to train at, and you go out and run with a plastic bag on you so you sweat a bit more, or then you skip for long periods of time. And obviously this kind of base building that we used to call it, it's obviously now the world like zone 2 that everyone's doing. And I think it's really interesting because for CrossFitters now, we're so used to feeling this intensity hit that if I don't do a session, or if I do a session and I haven't finished with that hit or that stimulus, I don't feel like I've worked. And I think there was a bit of retraining for some people of working back into the conditioning world of being like, okay, actually I can go and do a class and I can go and do something not necessarily that's going to like leave my lungs on fire, but I can go through this zone 2 and look at it as a productive session. For myself, I always thought, I didn't think I was opposed to that, the type of training and stuff, but I left when I was going through training in a slightly different way for this, I would have that same sensation of like, I'd finish a zone 2 run and I'd be like, oh, that's weird. I don't feel like I'm lying on my back, breathing super hard. And feeling okay with that and feeling like it's still a productive session is actually a bit of a shift and transformation. I think that if you want to start focusing on conditioning, it's something that you have to go through.
Yeah. I can't remember. I used to listen to Rob Wolf's podcast back in the day, in like the early days of paleo and CrossFit. I think he called it like the white elephant workouts or something like that, where you're just totally annihilated, and the olden days of Rabdo the Clown, and all these sorts of analogies. But yeah, I mean, I think it's learning, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's learning to leave a little bit in the tank rather than just constantly expending it all each and every workout.
Yeah, I think it's not always searching for the intensity as a metric of how hard the session is, or using that as a metric of achievement, like feeling like you push super hard and you get that feeling of burying yourself shouldn't always be the metric of success for how good the session went.
Right.
And I think it's it's an interesting thing because in the sports especially, ultimately that's what's being rewarded is the intensity of the session, your ability to do work in a short amount of time, and often that results in the feeling of the intensity being high.
Yeah, I see the light at the end of the tunnel sort of workouts are hopefully a little bit less.
You're making deals with the devil halfway through the workout,
Yes, we've all made those deals. Although I don't work, I'm a bodybuilder. I don't work as hard as you guys. You guys work too hard for me. I'm trying to leave reps in reserve. There's my metric that I like to. Get.
I think it's another. It's an interesting thing. And it's exactly the same move going from like CrossFit into bodybuilding. A lot of CrossFitters, when the fashion was back in the day weightlifting, we'd see a lot of CrossFitters transition into, because all of a sudden their numbers would be like national team level or however it may be, so they kind of get integrated into that sport. And again, the injury risk then was very high because they hadn't been used to training just what is in essence like clean and jerk and snatch. The variance, I think, is really useful. This idea of general physical preparedness is really useful for injury prevention. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to enter into a sport that's focused on specific movements, you have to build up to build the tolerance there.
Yeah, figuring out a way to...
I've not entered into the bodybuilding world. I don't think genetically I was predispositioned for that. But I think it's the same thing there. Like if you all of a sudden start going, just working certain body parts, working certain reps, then your body doesn't handle it if it's not been accustomed to going through that pattern.
Yeah, 100%.
I think it's a really important principle to understand, but the said principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands.
Right.
And it's super simple, but it really does make sense. If you want to be good at CrossFit, you have to be very comfortable in that with intensity. Otherwise, you're just not going to be good. And it's the same thing for running. If you want to be good at running, well, you're going to need to run. We might argue that certain people run a lot more at certain intensities or do more volume, but, we're kind of arguing in certain niches within this. The one thing that everyone's going to agree on is that you're not going to be a good runner if you don't run very much.
Right. We could if we were a bodybuilder, we could stimulate a muscle group in a variety of different ways. And I would say running is a little bit more akin to powerlifting. Like bodybuilding, there's a lot of different ways we can create this stimulus because the demand is very broad. To go back to that said principle, which we just need to influence our muscle metabolism. That's all we need to do. But for powerlifting, I would almost compare it a little bit more to that because we know what we're going to be assessed on. We have to squat, we have to bench, we have to deadlift, and we're going to have to expose ourselves to those movement patterns. Now, we could do a bunch of different variations of that. We can get creative in ways to stress that tissue and stress those systems. But at the end of the day, we got to get really good at squatting, benching, and deadlifting. So I imagine the charge is similar when you're programming for something like HYROX.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what, as I mentioned before, like the conjugate system was super interesting because Louis obviously came in and realized that, if someone was just training these 3 lifts, boom, 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 you're going to, if you don't have some variance, it's really hard to keep progressing, and probably the risk of injury also starts to go up. But then, you go to the other extremes of this where some of the old school weightlifting coaches, with the Bulgarian method, where they would go to this whole extreme of like, okay, actually let's completely isolate the certain movements and just train those movements to the max. And both guys have had world-class results using these different systems, but it's not like they were running, like it's not like Louis all of a sudden was having his athletes run 10k to get better at squat. You're not going to that level of variance.
Right.
Just you may be doing a slightly wider stance or using some kind of chain resistance in order to get there. It's still a squat pattern that you're working.
Yeah, or even bench presses, varying up your grips, or using boards or pin presses, things like that. Just
exactly, yeah.
Slicing that movement apart into its constituent components and spending different times focusing on each of those components.
Yeah, and in the running world, it's different, but there are parallels to the discussions that people have. You've got the Norwegian method, which has become very popular, but ultimately you're playing about with intensity and volume in the same kind of way, but just with running, how it happens to be the main component there.
Well, John, I'm very curious of your answer of this, so let's wrap on this question here. If I owned Corey CrossFit here in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where the weather is lovely, by the way, and I was interested, maybe my gym is seeing a downtick of members recently, and I'm really intrigued in adding HYROX to my gym because I think it might produce more members for me, get some new exposure to different types of customers, and just reinvigorate the gym a little bit. How would you go about advising me to implement HYROX? Like, what's a kind of like a mechanical order of operations I could quickly follow?
I think the first would be signing up to our program.
Going to need programming. So that's, yes, indeed.
No, I think it does help having some structure to go behind. And over the experience we've had with different gyms, there's different ways of implementing it. A lot of gyms throughout the week had like a softer day or more of a conditioning day. So I think that's the kind of easiest point of entry for gyms to start incorporating it. I also think it's a great way for gyms to then upskill the coaches. Maybe send some coaches off to running courses, being able to work with running groups. And I think if the kind of reasoning is I want to increase membership of my gym, going into new markets is something that's going to make that happen. And then kind of meeting up with local running groups, local running coaches, and starting to form some kind of relationship where, okay, hey, maybe we start a specialist class of running, which obviously has this big transfer to HYROX, then you're kind of being able to bring in their world and bring in your world to meet. And I think as well, if you're doing a great job, people are going to see those results of being able to move better, start to understand strength training. If you've been a runner for a lot of years, I think this is why HYROX has become so popular, because the runners looking to do something new have maybe a different exciting journey of getting a bit stronger, learning more complex gymnastic movements. Obviously, CrossFit's a great place to do that, and CrossFit Gym is obviously the place to be for that. And I think one thing that's really fun to do and a great way to test it out is run these mini simulation days. Maybe it's a Saturday, maybe it's a Sunday, but have a local community event where you may be speaking with this local running group. Obviously, the CrossFit Gym's a perfect place to do a HYROX simulation because you already have all the equipment. And so I think that combination of most CrossFit gyms have a conditioning day class. So obviously that's kind of like a soft launch to be able to see how popular it is. Being able to enter into new markets by starting to collaborate with local running groups. And also the great thing about the running groups, they typically don't have a gym. They're doing everything outside. So being able to get that combination there's no conflict of interest. And then thirdly, being able to run these like mini simulations or mini events where you may be doing some form of HYROX sim. It doesn't have to be exactly the race, and there's different ways you can stage and stagger that. We actually have a PDF on the events as well of how to organize that, but, then combine it with like a classic barbecue or however you may want to finish the day. But then you're getting new faces, new people into your gym. You're starting to grow your network by bringing more specialists in and being able to help out, to be able to upskill your coaches. And you kind of have everything you need already. Okay, maybe there's a couple of additional machines, or maybe there's a sled station that you kind of need to think about. But all these things are well within the realms of possibility for most.
And I think the HYROX sim advice is especially poignant, John. I think that's an excellent idea, because I've lived it. Being in Austin, HYROX is super popular. And these HYROX sim days, they're quite literally block parties for these gyms. Like you said, they're having barbecues, they're having people out, they're grilling, they're having a great time. And there's, in some cases, hundreds of people there. And I can assure everyone that all those hundreds of people are not all members of the gym. So it's an amazing way to get in front of new potential customers and hopefully, get them interested in joining the gym.
Yeah, I think with the new generation, the world is changing. I'm of the generation where when I was at university, like the social activity was you would go out and get drunk. You go out to a party, you would get drunk.
Right.
And the new generation, that's just not the case. And it's fascinating to witness it because obviously through my upbringing, my training, it was always a bit weird. I remember I had my friends at university, we were always a bit strange because we love training. We love everything about training. But we were super niche. We were like the kind of weird ones who wouldn't go out or wouldn't do those things. Whereas now it's completely shifted on its head. And there's you get a lot of these basically fake HYROXes, and in Mallorca, I mean, this is a bit of background, but the 99% of HYROX races, there's only very few that they do outside because they do them in indoor locations. And obviously to be able to run 8K with a reasonable number of laps, etc., you need a huge venue. Where we are in Mallorca, there's not a venue. So what tends to happen in these places where there aren't venues, you get these kind of fake HYROXes popping up, kind of similar, you kind of have stations that run, etc. And you had thousands of people there, and a really younger generation. And for me, it's great to see that this next generation's getting into training, getting into being a part of that. And they all want that social interaction, that social engagement, and making your gym the center of that. It's like the perfect thing to do, and you're appealing to the next generation. We also run a competition that's focused on the next generation of athletes called the Crown, and the popularity of kind of the sport of CrossFit for the next generation is not once what it was. And it's a really sad thing to see, and I think it's a really important trend that we need to reverse and try and bring that hype back to the next generation, get that inspiration going so that the sport continues to thrive. However, in the HYROX space, you notice that the age group is very young that's going to all of these things. And so it does allow, again, it might act as a great segue for people to get in there and get interested in more what happen to be, I suppose, more advanced styles of training.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with just, it's kind of shocking just to see how far fitness in general has come in terms of a cultural phenomenon. I mean, to your point, I think fitness is now monoculture. It used to be odd and niche, even just like what you said when you were back in school, but going back further, I mean, it was a weird thing to exercise. They have these videos of people doing Nautilus machines in the 80s, and it was like this weird, outlandish, what are these people doing with these odd contraptions? And now the bars are dwindling and alcohol sales have never been lower, but coffee clubs, HYROX sims, run clubs, these are where the next generation are headed to. That's where they're spending their time. So I think, to finalize your point there, I mean, I think you have an opportunity as a gym owner to engage in that new monoculture with things like HYROX sims and, community fitness events.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and it's often a question that gets posed, but I don't think training has ever been more popular, especially in the last number of decades. Really, CrossFit is in prime position to be able to optimize on that popularity. It's kind of like, if anything, right now it should have the highest number of affiliates and the highest number of people doing it, just because it's such commonplace for people to go and train and be in a gym. And CrossFit is so primed as a training methodology, as a space, in order to capitalize on that.
Well, that's an awesome place to end, John. We thank you so much for joining us. That was John Singleton, founder of the Progrm. If you're a Wodify customer, Wodify is fully integrated with the Progrm. So you're able to bring in John's programming for HYROX or more general programming right into your account automatically. And if you're not a Wodify customer, still check out John, check out the Progrm, whether it's HYROX programming or any other type of programming. They do great work, and we're so pleased to be joined by you today, John. Thank you for making the time.
Of course. And if anyone wants the PDF who listen to the podcast, they can just shoot us an email so we can send the HYROX Sim PDF to hopefully make the organization life a little easier.
That's awesome, John. I think that would be a perfect takeaway for anybody listening to this, and we'll make sure to link that PDF in the show notes, or at least a link to where they can go and get a copy for themselves. Awesome. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me.